Monica Gupta studied at the London School of Economics, where she earned bachelor's and master's degrees in 1973 and 1974. She completed a combined PhD in anthropology and demography at the University of Sussex in 1982, and then spent a decade as a researcher at the National Council of Applied Economic Research in New Delhi, India, before several research visits at Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies, the World Bank, and the Population Reference Bureau in Washington, D.C. Her work on this article took place during one of her research visits at Harvard. In 2012, she joined the sociology department at the University of Maryland as a research professor, where she remains today. P. N. Mari Bhat was born in India in 1951. He earned bachelor's degrees in physics, chemistry, and mathematics from the University of Mysore in 1970, and then switched to psychology for his 1972 master's degree from Andhra University. He finally discovered demography through a special diploma program from the Indian Institute of Population Studies. Entering graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, he earned both his master's and doctoral degrees in 1 year. His dedication to India and Indian demography drew him back to his home country, where he pursued a quiet but very productive research career, including this article. In 2005, he became the director of the institute, where he first discovered demography 30 years earlier. This article explores another of the consequences of the passage through the demographic transition from high to low birth and death rates. The authors started this research with the optimistic hypothesis that this transition would contribute to progress in eradicating entrenched discrimination against female children, since the transition is often linked to a larger process of modernization in general. You will see what they found when they looked into this question.
Explores another way that the demographic transition can affect life in a society that makes the transition from high to low birth and death rates. In addition to changes in the age structure of the population, this demographic transformation can ripple outward and have many other more subtle effects on people's lives. This particular study addresses a topic that Professor Gupta has had in her sights for most of her professional career: the issue of sex discrimination that can actually affect the most basic of life chances, the chance for life itself. If there is such a thing as human nature, in the sense of physiological and biological patterns that appear virtually everywhere, in all human societies throughout history, one aspect of that natural condition would show up if we measure the risks of death for men compared to women. From prenatal existence for fetuses during pregnancy to the very oldest years of life, human males seem to have a higher risk of death than do females. We can chalk up some of this risk to behaviors, particularly in young adulthood, but the fact that this higher risk appears from the moment of conception to the end of life suggests that it is built right into the species. Some physiologists have speculated that because women are the ones who bear the extra stresses and strains of pregnancy and childbirth, their systems include an extra margin of safety against many risk factors that is simply absent from men. Whatever the reason, men die more than women at every age. This is as true in infancy and childhood as it is at any other time of life, except, that is, in a few Asian cultures, including particularly India and China. In these places, the infant mortality rate, deaths among those less than a year old, is actually higher year after year for little baby girls than for little baby boys. Whenever you run into a systematic reversal of one of these supposed universal features of human life, all the little alarm bells should start to ring in the back of your mind, telling you that there must be something very strange about the culture where this occurs. In the case of India in particular, this excess female mortality stubbornly persists from year to year at scandalous levels. How does this pattern come about, and why would people continue practices that cause it? The how question has a quite complex answer. People in India are not just taking out their little girl babies and killing them, although the history of a number of different cultures around the world does include evidence of systematic infanticide. In contemporary India, the process operates more subtly. When it is time for dinner, the little boys are more likely to get large quantities of protein in their diet, while the little girls get more starches and other less nutritious fare. If somebody gets sick, the parent sweeps up the little boy and runs right off to the doctor, but is more likely to look at the little girl and say, maybe she'll get over it by tomorrow. Let's wait and see. All these little differences in treatment, none of which amount to much by themselves, can add up day after day and year after year and contribute to the exceptional pattern of excess female infant and child mortality. But why would mothers and fathers in India treat their little daughters this way? Are they wicked, heartless, and ignorant monsters? Of course they're not. Parents are parents everywhere in the world. But mothers and fathers in India, in China, and in some other Asian cultures live within their bubble of culture just as we live within ours. The Chinese have an old folk saying that nicely captures the problem facing these parents. They say that bringing up a daughter is like watering your neighbor's garden. This is because after they invest a couple of decades of love, attention, food, shelter, clothing, and medical care on their daughters, these young women then get married and move away to live with their husbands' families, producing children for those other families, cooking their meals, cleaning their house, and taking care of their husbands' parents when they get old and frail. Who takes care of the daughter's parents when they get old? The answer is either that the wife of their own son will see to that, or else it may not get done at all. So having a son is not just a preference, as we sometimes call it. It is an absolute necessity, one of life's central missions that you can't afford to ignore. It is this essential character of the need for a son that makes parents keep having children until they get at least one of these important commodities, and that makes them lavish time, attention, and resources on these sons to a greater extent than on daughters. Before you judge these parents too harshly, ask yourself how you would prepare for your own old age if there were no other supports other than what you could expect from your own children. Monica Dasgupta, who came from India to England for her college education, was intimately familiar with this system and why it exists. Still, it understandably has bothered her enough that she has devoted a lot of her life to documenting the problem and trying to figure out solutions. One of the projects she worked on in the early part of her career studied an area in India called Khana, where international organizations had set up detailed observation programs and health interventions to try to figure out how to improve many features of life in Indian society. She collected information from these observation programs and documented the patterns of infant and child mortality in this specific population. Excess infant mortality of girls did not show up at every point during their early lives. It was true that little girls were more likely to die than little boys between ages of 2 and 5. This was also true between ages 1 and 2. In fact, it was also true for infants under 1 year of age, except that this excess mortality pattern did not exist for neonatal mortality, that is, for deaths in the first month immediately after birth. What was different about that first month? The answer, she discovered, was simple. At the time of birth and immediately afterward, little babies, girls and boys alike, were caught up in the nets of the healthcare system in India. They were in hospital nurseries, examined by doctors and nurses, receiving the same inoculations and vitamins and other resources and services. And so long as they stayed in this modern medical environment, the natural human pattern appeared. The little girl newborns were less likely to die in this first month than were the little boy newborns. Only after they were wrapped up in blankets and carried home by their loving parents did the pernicious pattern of excess female infant and child mortality rear its ugly head. The social roots of this excess mortality problem, growing out of the actions of parents and other relatives, revealed itself also in another pattern that Dasgupta uncovered. She found that this excess female mortality did not appear among first births. The excess female mortality did appear, however, among second births, and the survival gap grew wider and wider at each higher birth order. Girls born as the fourth child or later in their families were almost 50% more likely to die by age 5 than were boys of the same birth order. So what, if anything, can be done about this discrimination against little girls and the resulting higher infant and child mortality among them? When Dasgupta and Bhat started this study, they were really hoping that the answer was already at hand. They hoped that the process of modernization and development would produce more rational attitudes about daughters, a higher standard of living, so that triage was not needed any longer against little girls, and just general enlightenment that would clear up the excess female infant mortality problem. They decided to collect some data and see whether signs of such progress might already be detected. But both share backgrounds in demography as well as economics. They wanted to pay particular attention to the demographic transition as one part of the larger process of modernization or development. Could the demographic transition somehow affect the deeply ingrained practices of discrimination responsible for excess female mortality among Indian infants and children? They had what seemed like at least a reasonable story about how this might be possible. The final stage of the demographic transition involves falling birth rates. When people begin to marry at older ages and then begin to space their births farther apart, they reach the end of childbearing ages with smaller families. The total fertility rate, for example, usually falls from over 5 or 6 children per woman to around 2 children per woman. Now, no matter how many children women are having, all of them who become mothers at all have had a first birth. We say that they have made the transition from parity 0, or no children, to parity 1, or 1 child born. Of the women who reach parity 1, some of them go on to parity 2 by adding a second child, and so on. As the birth rate declines, most women still become mothers. Most of them still reach parity 1. The big changes come at higher order parities. Because they started later and spend more time between births, they can actually run out of time to have the really high order births like 7th or 8th births. And of course, many women deliberately stop having babies when they reach their desired family size. Monica Dasgupta already has shown us that discrimination against little girls was weak or even non-existent for first births, and that it became more and more pronounced at higher and higher parities or birth orders. She and Gupta Bhat realized that maybe the fertility decline itself could eliminate a lot of that discrimination all by itself. They called this the parity effect, linking it to the disappearance of most of those higher order parities from the birth histories of women. You can't discriminate against a 4th or 5th birth if you stop with only 2 children. Since the first and second births do not experience as much discrimination as for later births in large families, maybe if families only have those first or second births, the total amount of discrimination going on against little girls will decline along with the birth rate. Dasgupta and Bhat were hoping to find this parity effect in their research. Wouldn't that be great? With this logic, they are making an obvious assumption about discrimination against little girls. The parity effect can only reduce discrimination if that discrimination is somehow fixed by parity for different births. If each birth order from the first birth to the 10th birth has its own characteristic level of discrimination, perhaps as parents get more and more desperate about having a baby boy or an additional boy baby, then this parity effect could work. If only the high parity births are at risk of different treatment, then the first births are safe, and the second births are pretty safe. Fertility decline, by eliminating the higher parity births from the plans and futures of countless families, might reduce discrimination, and possibly even reduce or eliminate excess female infant and child mortality as a bonus byproduct of the demographic transition. But we could also make a very different assumption about discrimination by parity, and Dasgupta and Bhat know this. They spell out this other alternative as well and call this option the intensification effect. According to this interpretation, discrimination in favor of boys at the expense of girls is going to happen at some point when parents come face to face with the cultural imperative that they must have at least one son who survives into adulthood so that they will be taken care of later on. Before any fertility decline, when typical family sizes are large and people have many children, they don't have to pay much attention to whether the first couple of births are girls or boys, because they know that even if the first 2 or 3 children are all girls, they're planning to have more children later. It's only when they come down to the last few children that they plan to have that they really must begin to think about making sure that they will have that surviving son in the picture. So, of course, the discriminatory behavior ramps up to higher levels in those final births. According to the intensification effect perspective, The actual parity or birth order of a birth doesn't have much to do with how that child gets treated. That is, treated especially well if he is a boy, or also perhaps more neglected if she is a girl. It is not a question of how many births have come before. Rather, it is a question of how many more births are still planned for the future. Whenever the expected number of future births begins to run out, parents begin to discriminate, consciously or perhaps only unconsciously, in favor of sons and against daughters. This means that if the last birth is a sixth birth, we can expect a lot of discrimination and excess female infant and child mortality among sixth births. But if the last birth is a second birth, then all that discrimination and excess female infant and child mortality will actually shift down to those parities instead. Whoever comes last or next to last will get the worst of this deeply ingrained customary behavior. If this is really what is happening, then far from reducing discrimination and excess deaths among little girls, fertility decline actually could increase the problem. This would happen because there would no longer be any birth orders where the little girls would be safe from discrimination. If you're only going to have 2 children, each one of them becomes incredibly important for meeting those cultural imperatives, and you need to start devoting extra protection and resources to the little boys, starting already with the first birth. If a little girl is a first birth and something happens to her, well, then the next birth will become the first surviving birth, and that might turn out to be a boy. Das Gupta and Bhat no doubt fervently hoped that this much less pleasant picture would never show up in their results. Does fertility decline automatically also reduce excess mortality among little girls in India through a parity effect? Or does fertility decline actually make the situation worse and increase excess mortality among little girls in India through an intensification effect? Since they as scientists were dedicated to finding out the facts of the situation, they could only lay out these 2 very different possible scenarios for the effects of fertility decline, and then line up the actual data and see how things came out. Their results clearly show that the net result of fertility decline in India actually increases excess female infant and child mortality in India. On one side of the balance, fewer women are making the transitions to higher parities, so that a rising share of the births are first or second births. If discrimination and resulting excess female mortality were fixed for each parity, then this shift to lower parities would have reduced the survival gap for little girls by 9%. But on the other side of the balance, increasing discrimination and excess female deaths for each birth order considered by itself would produce a 25% increase in the overall excess of female infant and child mortality in India. The net result of these 2 counteracting trends worsened the situation for girl babies compared to boy babies in India. This worsening gap in survival, in the form of increasing excess female compared to male death rates among infants and children, contributes to a longer-term trend in India of a falling ratio of females to males in the population. But higher mortality of girls after birth is only one part of the picture investigated by Das Gupta and Bhat. The sex ratio observed in a population depends on these relative risks of death for females compared to males at all ages, but it also depends on the sex ratio of births. The sex ratio is usually expressed as number of boys per 100 or 1,000 girls, but Das Gupta and Bhat use a non-standard version that measures the number of girls per 1,000 boys instead. By this measure, the deficit of females in India has been increasing throughout the 20th century. The fact that we can observe this gradually increasing deficit of girls also among registered births means that not only is there excess female mortality after babies are born, but that fewer girls are surviving the gestational period of pregnancy and being born in the first place. This suggests that there might be prenatal selection operating against girls in India, as well as postnatal discrimination once they're born. We turn next to this issue of prenatal sex selection. One of the apparent biological constants of the human species is higher mortality at every age for males than for females. This unbalanced survival pattern might seem inconsistent with the tendency for balance in all things in nature, but don't worry, the human species turns out to be just as balanced as any other. To balance the higher risks of death among males, there's another constant in human nature, what we call the secondary sex ratio, or the sex ratio of boys to girls at birth. This ratio, usually expressed as male births per 100 female births, turns out to be about 105 boys for every 100 girls born. This same ratio appears in virtually all populations of humans all over the world and has been constant for as long as we have any records to calculate it. When you start with those 105 boys per 100 girls born, and subject the boys to slightly higher risks of death as they go through life, you reach a point at which the two sexes are evenly balanced at 100 to 100. This usually occurs around age 50, very close to the end of the reproductive ages for women. A more elegant biological balance would be hard to imagine. So long as women are in the age range where they can have children, there are at least enough men to go around so that each woman has a decent chance of a partner and some children. After that, of course, nature has no more interest in sex ratios, so the continued higher death rates of men rapidly feminizes the sex ratio. The number of men per 100 women falls lower and lower. By the time people get to old ages, a chronic shortage of men sets in. In our 80s and 90s, we all find ourselves living in a Beach Boys world, where there are at least 2 girls for every boy. But during the reproductive ages, when it matters for the continuation of the species, there are plenty of men around. Except, that is, in East Asian societies, such as India, China, Korea, and perhaps 1 or 2 other places where patriarchal rules have a particularly strong grip on people's lives. These societies experience a chronic shortage of women, or excess of men, depending on how you want to look at it, precisely because they've been culturally conditioned to eliminate female offspring. The problem of higher death rates for girls than for boys in the years immediately after birth shows us one side of this selection that operates against girls, creating the observed imbalance in the sex ratio throughout life. The other side of the sex selection coin occurs during pregnancy, so we call this prenatal sex selection. One way to accomplish such selection would be for a woman to visit a doctor or a clinic early in the course of her pregnancy and undergo an ultrasound scan of the fetus. If the ultrasound scan suggests that she is pregnant with a girl, the pregnancy can be aborted. Although there are laws against using ultrasound technology simply to determine whether to abort a female fetus, the practice is widespread throughout India, China, Korea, and other East Asian societies. Once a technological genie like this gets out of the bottle, so to speak, it is not very likely that we will ever get it back into the bottle again and put the cork back in. Gupta and Bhat estimate from sex ratios at birth that there are not enough registered births of girls, given the natural sex ratio. From this they infer that something like 1 million female fetuses were aborted in India between 1981 and 1991. This sounds like a horrifying amount of sex-selective induced abortion, but we have to remember that there are now over 1 billion people in India, and that even this huge absolute number of abortions over a 10-year period works out to be about 1% of the number of remaining female births that did take place in the country. Still, even if 1% of pregnancies aborted increases the surplus of men, or the deficit of women if you measure girl births per 100 boy births, as do Gupta and Bhat, with the sex ratio already starting with fewer than normal female births, the higher than normal mortality that they experience after birth then reinforces a starting deficit. Within India, sex-selective abortion is more likely to reduce the share of female fetuses surviving to birth in some regions than in others. In general, more such sex-selective abortion occurs in the Ganges River plain running across the north of India, reaching its highest level in the northwest region of Punjab. Although to document this clear focus of the phenomenon, Gupta and Bhat offer only some brief suggestions about why this regional pattern might exist. They point out that both rural and urban populations in the north and northwest of India have better access to medical facilities, including the places where ultrasound scans can reveal the sex of the fetus, and also the clinics where induced abortions can be performed. But if we think back to the remarks of Kingsley Davis, that any kind of birth control is only useful if people want to use it, we don't get much idea from Dasgupta and Bhat about why people in this region might be more intensively caught up in the patriarchal preference for sons than people in the south of India. Only experienced experts on the history and culture of India could deal with this subject in the detail that it deserves. But it might be worth pointing out that it is in the northwestern part of India where cultures and religions from the Indian subcontinent have come into direct contact and competition with cultures and religions from the Middle East. The Vale of Kashmir, adjacent to the Punjab, is the focal point for the centuries-old competition between Islam and Hinduism. Kashmir includes one territory that is still disputed between the governments of Pakistan and India. Kashmir is the home of the Sikh religion, a synchronistic combination of ideas from both Islam and Hinduism that guarantees that both Muslims and Hindus will consider the Sikhs as heretics. When these competing systems come into direct conflict, a conflict that has endured now for centuries, perhaps the emphasis on sons taps into issues of physical safety as well as considerations of old age support or family continuity. But on the other hand, as Dasgupta and Bhat point out, the fertility decline also has been stronger in this north and northwest part of India in recent decades. Maybe that by itself is all we really need to understand the stronger tendency toward both sex-selective abortion before birth and higher mortality of girls after birth in these regions. Maybe it is just a question of having fewer births in which to be sure that you have that boy child to guarantee your future. In any case, it is not just in Punjab or in northern India or in India as a whole where these two sides of the hyper-masculine sex ratio appear. Dasgupta and Bhat also show us these same patterns of sex-selective abortion before birth and discrimination leading to higher female mortality after birth appearing in other countries. The strongest such pattern, leading to the largest deficit of girls in the resulting population, appears in Korea. This might reflect, they suggest, the very low level of overall fertility in Korea, coupled with the advanced state of medical technology in the country that makes it possible for women to know and react to the sex of each conception relatively quickly and easily. The reasons why they might want to use such technology also include increasing opportunities for women in the labor force combined with a still strongly patriarchal culture. The large deficit in female births, increasing sharply at higher parities, also appears in China. This means that as a feature of life in both China and India, countries that combine to include about a third of the entire human population on Earth, a deeply ingrained cultural pattern removes females both before and after live birth. The hope that modernization and fertility decline might reduce or even eliminate this excess female mortality and rebalance sex ratios has not materialized. Instead, fertility decline appears to have increased selective pressures against girls both before and after birth in these countries. The only little glimmer of good news that Dasgupta and Bhat can come up with to console us in their conclusions is that later marriages, more spacing between births, and fewer children, the components of fertility decline, do seem to have improved the health of women in adulthood. They now experience lower rates of death from maternal complications of childbirth and also from other causes. At least the shortage of women that results from culture-driven practices early in life is very slightly offset by improved survival for women later on. This may be cold comfort in societies where millions and millions of men will not be able to find partners in adulthood, and where millions and millions of women will not live to experience that adulthood at all. But in this context, we have to take what we can get.